On this 30th Sunday of Ordinary Time, we began our readings by hearing from the great prophet Jeremiah, who prophesied about a new exodus. He describes the exiles from the Babylonian exile returning to Jerusalem, returning to Zion, God's dwelling place in Jerusalem after their exile. And Jeremiah wasn't the only prophet to speak of this sort of return from Babylon. In fact, every prophet that did prophesy about this return to Zion spoke of it as a new exodus. The prophets spoke of God leading the exiles through the desert on a new path, on the new way. The overarching theme here is that God himself is going to save his people at a future time of salvation. God himself is going to establish a new way. He's going to establish a new path for his people, for the exiles on earth to return to him. And Jeremiah prophesies, too, that a sign of sorts that this new exodus has begun, that this new way has been established, you might say, will be seen by those who take part in this act of the new exodus. And one of those are the blind, and one of those are the lame. So in our gospel from St. Mark, we see this interaction between Jesus and Bartimaeus. Here Bartimaeus is blind and caught in poverty because of his physical ailment. He's reduced to living the life of a simple beggar outside the walls of Jericho. And as Jesus is passing by, Bartimaeus hears that it is Jesus of Nazareth. So at this point in Jesus' fame, you might say, had been spreading across the land. Every time that he performed a miracle, he would instruct the person or persons not to tell anyone about it so that his identity wouldn't be revealed too early, namely that he was God incarnate. But nonetheless, as we're well aware, scriptures relate to us that the more he told them not to tell anyone about it, the quicker that his fame spread. For those who do encounter Jesus, they simply cannot keep it to themselves. So here's Bartimaeus, blind, a beggar, who has heard about this mysterious man, Jesus of Nazareth, and now that he is passing by. And so he calls out to him. And this hits on an important spiritual lesson for us today. We can ask the question, why would Bartimaeus call out to Jesus? It's because he recognizes his poverty, not only materially as a beggar, but also physically as a blind man. In a sense, we might say that he was humbled by his conditions. He was humbled by where he found himself, humble enough to the point that he was willing to call out to Jesus. He had a certain humility which we can very easily lack ourselves when we are materially and physically secure. Underneath the facade of our ego lies our true selves, lies our heart, which is like Bartimaeus. Our heart is like Bartimaeus in that it is blind and it is poor. It cannot see the way, and it's crying out to God. But far too often, we don't like to look at that. We don't like to look at our hearts because we find it very uncomfortable. And furthermore, the enemy doesn't want us to look at our hearts either, because he fears that if we look at our hearts, then we might actually recognize our true dependence upon God. The enemy is like the other people in the crowd who, when seeing Bartimaeus crying out from his heart, they try to silence him. They try to shut him down. So very often we listen to that voice, or we even let our egos silence the deep desires of our hearts. We let the enemy get in the way of the relationship that we desire. But Bartimaeus, out of his humility, did not let that stop him. He did not let those voices stop him. Instead, he called out all the more, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And at this point, Jesus stops and he instructs the crowd to call him. Jesus takes the initiative now to call Bartimaeus to himself, despite what the crowd is saying, despite what all those voices are saying to him. And similarly, Jesus takes the initiative to call the heart that is calling out to him to himself, despite whatever the enemy might be saying to silence our hearts or whatever our egos might be saying to try to quiet those desires. Interestingly, the Greek verb used to say call is kaleo, from which comes the Greek word ekklesia, which means church. So Jesus calls people, he invites them into relationship with him, and in so doing, he gathers the church to himself. He gathers his church to himself. As Bartimaeus now approaches Jesus, out of a response of being called, Jesus now asks him this question: "What do you want me to do for you?" And here we see the dynamic of prayer. It's always God's initiative to call out to the heart. He makes the first move, but he desires that we respond to his call. He does not desire some passive disciples. He doesn't desire some puppets. He wants us to be actively engaged in our healing, in our prayer, in our discipleship, in whatever it is that he calls us to. He wants us to be active in that process. In the original Greek, we see Bartimaeus now refer to Jesus as Rabboni, not as our translation has it now as master. And Rabboni means teacher, but more specifically it means my teacher. So he's now affirming, in a sense, a personal relationship that he has with Jesus. It affirms, too, that Bartimaeus has, you might say, placed himself under Jesus as well, again, coming from that place of humility. He is settled in at his appropriate place in the great theodrama, as Bishop Barron might put it. And out of this place of faith, Jesus affirms that his faith has made him well, and the gospel affirms that Bartimaeus, quote, followed him on the way. So what is the way? Well, first, it's one of the earliest names of the church, found in the book of Acts of the Apostles. It means that he is now journeying with Jesus, which is the very end of prayer. It's what we're truly seeking in prayer. It means that Jesus has ushered in this new exodus. He's ushered in this new way, prophesied by the prophet Jeremiah in our first reading. Our hearts hurt, our hearts are troubled, and our hearts' restlessness is not calmed by answers to questions, but by presence, by simply journeying with Jesus, by simply being with Jesus. So don't listen to the voice of the crowd, the enemy, or the ego, which tries to silence those deepest desires of your heart. The Lord desires to meet you in the deepest desires of your heart, in that place of prayer, and to lead you on that new way, to lead you into the new exodus. The Venerable Bede said of this gospel, his reason, Jesus' reason, for asking is that prayer might be made to him. He puts the question to stir up the blind man's heart to pray. Therefore, let us also imitate him. Let us not seek for riches, earthly goods, or honors from the Lord, but for that light which we alone with the angels can see, the way to which is faith.